Extrapolating from his Peace Corps travels, he had realized that Asia, Africa, and South America would assume that whoever had killed President Kennedy would now be president. Maybe. We've read articles about that, haven't we? Dispelling that notion was important. The sooner the world was told that Johnson was not an employer of the Bravos, the better off the United States would be. Hello, welcome back to my channel. I'm Jess, and if you're new, then welcome. I'd love to earn your subscription today. Well, I think it's part 9. I can't really keep up anymore, but I think we're on part 9 of William Manchester's serialized book, The Death of a President. I do want to invite you, I don't always do this, but would you like this video? Would you also please share your comments as you go through the video if things stand out to you? I don't want you to forget. So if something stands out to you, just pause the video and add your thoughts because I want to hear those things. And also, if you are not subscribed, would you do so? If you've enjoyed it this far, if you've made it to number 9, then join me for future discussions, whether we're doing JFK, Kennedy-related items, or other interesting things from history. I would love for you to be a part of those learning opportunities and discussions. So please hit that subscribe button. Depending on how many we get through today, we will either have 3 including this episode or 2 including this episode. So we'll see what we get through. We'll continue from our reading last time. I want to remind you, if this is your first time with us, this book was later published. I have it here on my shelf somewhere, right there. But this was the way it was released, was in Look magazine. It was serialized. This is part 4, and it was the final part that was released in this manner. So that's what we're reading. The East Room was hushed, and the Oval Office naked, but the Vice Presidential Suite had never been busier. There was a physical, visible frontier between the two administrations that morning. On one side of the twin row of cars stood the elegant old executive mansion, haunted by the ghost of the youngest man ever elected to the presidency. On the other side, preoccupied men darted in and out of the executive office building. Certain individuals crossed the frontier, Johnson himself among them. All were aware of its existence, however, and the leadership of the executive department was split into 2 camps. At one end of the spectrum were the loyalists, Schlesinger, Ted Sorenson, O'Donnell, and their leader, Robert Kennedy, who, despite the gloomy sky, had donned dark glasses after the Mass to conceal his swollen eyes. Good grief, he had been through so many things, hadn't he? At the other end stood the realists, men like Mac Bundy, who repeatedly reminded other members of the Kennedy team that, quote, the show must go on, end quote, and declared that he, for his part, intended to remain as long as he was wanted and needed by the President of the United States. Sorenson saw the issue rather differently. At 7:30 p.m., he went over to the EOB at the invitation of the President, who solicited his advice about personnel. Sorenson said quietly, "You have 2 kinds of problems. Those who will not make themselves available to you, and those who will be too available." That's a good insight for any president. There's some people who will not help you, but maybe you need their help. And there's some people who are just too happy to help you and aren't actually a help to you at all. This last point was subtle, but some felt it keenly. As the day grew older, individual resentments deepened. To some, the conduct of those who could think of the president as an impersonal institution was considered callous. Dodging across rain-swept West Executive, Kenneth Galbraith saw a cabinet member, seized his arm, and said urgently, "We've got to take care of some of these liberals now so they don't go shooting off their mouths." A curious choice of words from the author of The Liberal Hour. There were those in the administration who felt that such demeanor was correct, but it was undoubtedly controversial. Some of those whose alacrity was regarded with disapproval were not conscious of the reproachful glances around them. One confided to his diary that he heard no bitter word and only encouragement from both sides in my double loyalty. He was misinformed. The words were spoken. He just didn't hear them. Of this same man, a colleague was writing in his diary, I have never seen his instinct for power more naked and ruthless. To be charitable, Schlesinger observed the following spring, the government would have been paralyzed if everyone behaved like me and Ken O'Donnell. That is charitable. At the time, he wrote that, for some people, personal emotion is very difficult. Bundy has everything under iron control. I do not think that this means that they feel things less than the rest of us. It didn't. Bundy, too, had cried in the night. Schlesinger, Galbraith, and Bundy had all been recruited from the Harvard faculty. O'Donnell was not seen in the vice presidential suite all day, yet O'Brien went over to discuss a congressional maneuver that would boost the Russia wheat sale. And Sergeant Shriver, President Kennedy's brother-in-law, was a realist by any standard. Anxious to see an orderly change of government, Shriver walked across West Executive Avenue and volunteered his services. When he attempted to bring the two groups together and ran into what he called a lot of flack, he was baffled. The Loyalists, swept up in the mightiest current of emotion in their lives, were determined to show proper respect toward the murdered president. The Realists played a valuable and difficult role, and history may award them the higher grade, for their service to the national interest was great. The country, hypnotized by the catafalque, was unaware of any conflict within the government. It was virtually impossible to think beyond yesterday's death and the coming funeral. Hugh Sidey argued in vain that Time should hold its cover portrait of the new chief executive for another week's issue because nobody is interested in Johnson. Not many were. Nevertheless, depicting his mood during his first full day in office is a matter of intrinsic interest. The man's chameleon nature has never been more evident. There have never been so many Lyndon Johnsons. His aide, George Reedy, saw Lyndon the clairvoyant. Everything was chaotic, Reedy said afterward. Only the president knew what he was doing. Kenneth Galbraith was greeted by the left-of-center champion. I want to come down hard on civil rights, Johnson told him. Not because Kennedy was for it, but because I am for it. Keep in mind that I want a liberal policy because I'm a Roosevelt Democrat. The president was exploiting his great gift for exposing this or that facet of his character so that each visitor would leave with a feeling of warmth and reassurance. Since the visitors entered one at a time, his success was almost universal. The out-and-out loyalists, while remaining distrustful of colleagues who had raced to a room 274 in the East Executive Office Building, saw a Lyndon so humble, so shattered by his own anguish, that even Theodore Sorenson and Arthur Schlesinger were impressed. To British Ambassador Sir David Ormsby Gore, this Lyndon said brokenly, "If my family took a vote on whether or not I'd stay, there'd be 3 votes for quitting right away, and maybe 4. That Lyndon vanished, and another appeared, shrewdly advising Larry O'Brien on a technical point of parliamentary procedure. There is no way to reconcile the various members of the flexible presidential cast. The fact is that each played his part superbly and richly deserved applause. Only the naive would be offended by the variety. John Kennedy would have been engrossed by it. Which was the real Johnson is a question best left to his biographers. Overnight, he had acquired fresh momentum, and those who were skeptical of his wisdom could not doubt his stamina. Repeated calls were placed to John and Nellie Connolly at Parkland. He fenced sharply with the soft-spoken but immovable Nick Katzenbach over whether the assassination should be investigated by a federal or state board of inquiry. Remember, last time he was pushing to have only Texas people on the commission to investigate the assassination of the president. He applied the Johnsonian cattle prod to J. Edgar Hoover, who by now was dispatching fleets of agents to Love Field. He proclaimed Monday a day of official mourning. He received Supreme Court Justice Arthur Goldberg, and he took time to pose for still photographs with Dean Rusk, McGeorge Bundy, Robert McNamara, and Dwight Eisenhower, which were released to the networks at 5:13 p.m. Quote, "First pictures of LBJ at work as president," end quote. In lesser jobs, there is a direct correlation between efforts and results, but as Kennedy could have told Johnson, and as Johnson painfully learned that first day, the ratio is meaningless in the presidency. Historic achievements may be credited to a chief executive while he is fast asleep. Awake, he may sweat like a slave and accomplish nothing. Johnson's Saturday was a curve that alternately plunged and zoomed and ended nowhere. After his encounter with Robert Kennedy, he had enjoyed a pleasant interim. The congressional leadership had trooped into the EOB to promise its support. It was after this heartening pledge that the president, joined by his wife, led the leadership past the waiting cabinet into the East Room. Leaving the catafalque, he cited Dwight Eisenhower and invited him to cross the street for a 20-minute talk. Actually, the appointment turned out to be the longest of Johnson's day. It lasted 2 hours, and to the 34th president, the 36th seemed unsure of himself. I'd known him a long time. He was, as he always is, nervous, walking around and telephoning everyone. I would mention someone in the conversation, and he would snatch up the receiver and call the person. He asked my advice about many matters, including the tax cut. I told him that he had to show what he was going to do with his own budget. We also discussed foreign affairs. As far as I could see at that time, Lyndon Johnson's only intent was to find out what was going on and carry policy through. He suggested nothing new or different. He wanted to talk about Laos, Cuba, and so forth. He did seem to be less informed about foreign policy than about domestic policy. We have a few photographs here in the middle that I will show you. This has the Lincoln Memorial in the distance, along with the flame. It says, "The energy, the faith, the devotion to which we bring to this endeavor will light our country and all who serve it, and the glow from that fire can truly light the world." Then we have, "Let the word go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike that the torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans." And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. During the long session, Mac Bundy tiptoed in and placed Schlesinger's letter of resignation on the desk. Johnson glowered. "Tell him to take it back," he said. "I don't want any such letters, and tell everyone I mean that." Eisenhower suggested to Johnson that he was making a mistake. According to his recollection, his words were, "Take them all. You must be your own self. You must establish yourself. You should take them now, and then decide in the next 3 or 4 days which ones you are going to accept." Johnson regarded him moodily. After the funeral, he was to become adept at shaping his staff, easing out even those advisors who would have preferred to stay. On November 23rd, however, he treated any suggestion of change with a negative, highly emotional response, and he seemed to regard retirement from the government as tantamount to desertion. At that afternoon's cabinet meeting, Dean Rusk reminded him that it was traditional for all cabinet members to submit resignations when a new president took office. Johnson shook his head doggedly. He said he wanted every man there as a Johnsonian advisor. Rusk pointed out that precedent was involved. Some future chief executive might not want all his ministers to stay. Still, Johnson balked. The cabinet resignations, which went in anyhow, weren't even acknowledged. And when he met Sorenson that evening and Sorenson mentioned his own note, the president replied brusquely, "I know, I got your letter," and quickly changed the subject. The new president and the new first lady attended a memorial service for Kennedy. 24 hours had passed now since the assassination. It was past noon once more, and Schlesinger had arranged what came to be known as the Harvard lunch in a private upstairs room of the Occidental restaurant on the opposite side of the Treasury building from the White House. Afterward, Galbraith wrote in his journal that Arthur was in a rather poor mood. He was reacting far too quickly to the chemistry of the moment and was dwelling on the possibility of a ticket in 1964 headed by Bob Kennedy and Hubert Humphrey. This, of course, is fantasy, unless, of course, Johnson stumbles unbelievably, or even then. Schlesinger's own estimate of his guest is instructive. Like Mack, Ken is a realist. He would infinitely have preferred Kennedy, but he is ready to face facts and make the best of them. Like Kenny and Bobby, I am a sentimentalist. My heart is not in it. The aftermath of the luncheon was equally typical. Schlesinger attended a staff meeting where Bundy implored everyone to stick to his post, and Galbraith collided with the new president on West Executive. "I've been looking for you," Johnson said. Galbraith doubted that this was true. "I want to see you. Come on up." Johnson asked him to write a speech for delivery before a joint session of Congress. Galbraith, having finished a eulogy of Kennedy for the Washington Post that morning, craved another excuse to finger a typewriter keyboard and was immensely flattered. He needn't have been. The president was making the same request of a half-dozen men. If you were literate, informed, and empathetic, you were being drafted. The next chapter. Johnson yearned to speak to the Congress, and understandably so. The people had been badly shaken. The sooner they heard the voice of their new leader in an address of substance, the better. He was still holding back, feeling his way. At 2:30 p.m., however, he would have his matchless opportunity to take a real sounding. That was the time set for the cabinet meeting. Thick yellow pads and sharpened pencils had been laid out at each place along the perimeter of the long table in the cabinet room. The vice president's chair had been moved around to the president's spot, and one of the men present would be the new head of the family, Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy. "Gentlemen, the President of the United States," Rusk said at the outset, and they all rose. The meeting was not a triumph. The ministers were in a state of abnormal depression. Johnson had a few things going for him. Bundy had prepared a discreet memorandum on what he, quote, might want to say, end quote, and everyone present was anxious to pull the country together. But the catastrophe had been too recent. They couldn't forget that the corpse of the man who had appointed them all rested in a wooden coffin on the other side of this same building. The new president was further hampered by his own bearing. A total stranger might have imposed his personality upon them, but Lyndon, as they still thought of him, was a familiar figure who had attended their previous sessions as a subordinate and who now presided in his meekest manner. Recalling the president's treatment of his memo, Bundy wrote 10 days later that it was typical of him that he made it his own in action. Johnson opened with a silent prayer, begged their guidance in the perilous times ahead, and added a short appeal that several of them by now could have recited from memory. He told them that he needed them more than President Kennedy had. The Attorney General's participation in the 25-minute meeting must be treated scrupulously, for the friction between the two men may easily be distorted by partisans. Each was under unprecedented pressure. If Johnson's discomfort seems ungenerous, it should be remembered that to the new chief executive, Bob Kennedy represented a problem that was unique in the history of presidential succession. Here was a cabinet member who looked like, sounded like, and thought like the slain leader, who had been his second self, who was one of his two chief mourners, and who, at times, had, as everyone around this table knew, exercised executive power in his brother's name. It was as though Edwin Stanton had been Abraham Lincoln's twin. Historians would be obliged to sympathize with Andrew Johnson, for his contemporaries would have made few allowances, and it is unlikely that Stanton would have been as forbearing as Bob Kennedy. The Attorney General, for his part, had been preoccupied with the coming funeral. His very presence in the cabinet room was something of an accident. After the Mass, he had walked over from the mansion with McNamara, Bill Walton, Jim Reed, Chuck Spaulding, and Lem Billings to see whether all his brother's belongings had been removed. He had noticed that Master Sergeant Joe Giordano had neglected to take President Kennedy's cabinet chair, and early in the afternoon he decided to check again. The cabinet had already convened. Bundy, glimpsing him, persuaded him to enter and sit in his own chair. In Mac's words of 11 days later, Bobby was late, and perhaps would not have attended if I had not told him he must. His condition was that there should be no pictures, which I now know was as hard for the president as a ban against smoking for a 30-year addict, though he accepted it readily in the interest of harmony. Mac's version that afternoon was more tart. To a colleague, he said that he was worried about Bobby, that Bobby was reluctant to face the new reality, and that he had to virtually drag Bobby into the cabinet meeting. Well, I feel like that's really ridiculous that he would think, less than 36 hours after his brother is murdered, up all night, mourning, that he would even want to attend at all is remarkable. Kennedy's own recollection was merely that I went by and Mac Bundy said it was very important that I come in. So I went. His appearance evoked a dramatic response. Several members leaped to their feet, and one clasped his hand and clapped him on the back. Others, including Johnson, did not move. The Attorney General sat back, brooding, his heavy eyes hooded. Yet, for a man in his position, silence itself can be significant. A half hour earlier, one television network had openly speculated that Bobby Kennedy might resign. His immediate future was being debated in millions of offices and homes, and his laconic manner was noted and remembered by everyone around the table, by President Johnson, perhaps most of all. After the president had finished, two men spoke. UN Ambassador Adlai Stevenson, because of his seniority in the party, and Dean Rusk, as leader of the cabinet. Their motives were identical. They wanted the record to show that they intended to keep faith with the new administration. Stevenson was surprisingly awkward. The most experienced and eloquent orator there, he had written a 5-paragraph testimonial, which he proceeded to read, word for word. He reminded them that he had pledged his support at President Kennedy's first cabinet meeting, repeated that pledge now, and said that there can only be a moment's pause in the nation's business, and declared to Johnson, "Your unique qualities of character, wisdom, and experience are a blessing to our country in this critical hour, and our confidence in your leadership is total." Rusk was equally determined to praise Johnson. After the Johnson-Rusk colloquy over letters of resignation, the president asked that they all submit departmental recommendations by Monday. They then dispersed. Nothing had been accomplished, and it was impossible for any of them to leave with a feeling of achievement. Even Johnson, who had been delighted by Rusk and Stevenson, appeared to be disappointed. His subsequent remarks that afternoon indicate that he had hoped for more. To Bundy, it had been a drab little meeting. Secretary of Labor Willard Wirtz thought it was awful and almost mechanical. Another cabinet member, who had expected the president to be strong and affirmative, concluded that it was highly unsatisfactory, and one member of the cabinet decided to speak to him about it. Cliff Carter, a Johnson aide, led him into the EOB office, where the secretary emphatically recommended to the president that he speak first to the people and then to the Congress. To the astonishment of the caller, Johnson's style had been completely altered in the few minutes since they had adjourned. It was another of those quick change miracles. In the cabinet room, he had been hesitant, but now, as the secretary noted in his journal, the frustration seemed gone. He seemed relaxed. The power, the confidence, the assurance of Majority Leader Lyndon Johnson seemed to be there. To this distinguished diarist, the new president spoke frankly of the tension between himself and the Attorney General. He said, "Jackie has just been great. She said she'd move out as soon as she could, and I said, 'Honey, you stay as long as you want. I have a nice, comfortable home, and I'm in no hurry. You have a tragedy and many problems.' His real problems, he indicated, were with Bob. He was convinced that Kennedy's late arrival at the meeting had been intentional, and he insisted that Kennedy, bent upon humiliating him, had confided to an aide that we won't go in unless he has already sat down. Kennedy denies this. When the president's interpretation was described to him, he expressed first amazement, then amusement. The charge seems to have been unjust, but it was perhaps an inevitable consequence of the LBJ-RFK relationship, or to be more precise, of the relationship between certain of their advisors. Since the 1960 Los Angeles Convention, we just read about this about a month ago. If you go back and look at the 4 days before RFK's assassination article that we read through, it goes into an extensive part about the relationship between RFK and LBJ, in particular because of this convention. Since the 1960 Los Angeles Convention, the association of the two principals had been repeatedly damaged by misunderstandings that could usually be traced to this or that aide. Thus, the vice president had been convinced that the attorney general had never forgiven him for his remarks at Los Angeles, critical of Joseph P. Kennedy, their father. Ironically, Robert Kennedy had neither heard the criticism nor read it. Johnson men were convinced that Bob disliked their leader. Kennedy men repeatedly reassured them without success, and the Johnson administration had scarcely begun to gather momentum before the press speculated at length on the feud between the two men. To be sure, in temperament and manner, they were very unlike. That had also been true of John Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson. It had not led to a vendetta then, nor did it now. Whatever the source of the strain, its existence was unquestionable. The consequences of Robert Kennedy's tardiness, Johnson told his caller, had been deeply embarrassing. By entering in the middle of the president's remarks, the attorney general had destroyed their effect. The secretary, who was sympathetic and immediately conveyed his sympathy to another cabinet member who had regarded the meeting as a disaster, wrote that there was real bitterness in Lyndon's voice on this one. Clearly, Johnson regarded the late president's brother as a formidable obstacle. He agreed with his visitor that he ought to speak to the Congress as soon as possible. Congress was thinking of recessing. Yet Johnson was apprehensive that an earlier address than the one he had tentatively planned might be resented by the family. Having made what he described as his pitch for a quick address, the caller left. In the suite's anteroom, Sergeant Shriver was waiting. Shriver was one member of the family who had felt close to Johnson, and he wanted to wish him well. "Is there anything I can do?" Shriver inquired. There were, he was told, 2 unresolved questions: the occupancy of the Oval Office and the timing of the address to the joint session. Interestingly, Johnson displayed little interest in a nationwide speech during these days. He was concerned first with the Congress, not the people. A televised address on the Hill would, of course, reach just as many Americans as a White House fireside chat. Johnson observed that Rusk and Bundy, among others, strongly believed that he should be meeting his appointments in the West Wing, pointing to the symbolic importance of the presidential residence in the mansion. Furthermore, he observed he would be much closer to vital communications equipment there. Lastly, both Johnson and Bill Moyers emphasized the urgency of a joint session on Tuesday. The State Department was pressing him especially hard. The president was in no hurry to evict Mrs. Kennedy. On the contrary, he was content to sleep at the Elms indefinitely. It was the chief executive's office in the West Wing that he wanted, not the pomp of the executive mansion. Shriver's position was awkward. He was foggy about precedents, and his devotion to the Peace Corps had left him little time to explore other governmental labyrinths. "I remembered that the West Basement had been chewed up when Jack was president," he said later, "and while I hadn't known what was going on, I had a hunch it had something to do with the hotline." Shriver, normally quick to make up his mind, couldn't decide about the Oval Office. In his words, Bundy, whom the president was quoting to him, quote, felt that it was first of all the president's office, while the family naturally felt that it was Jack's office. "I'd been in the Navy, and I was inclined to agree with Bundy. You don't leave a command post empty because the commander has fallen. On the other hand, it seemed unseemly speed to move into that office before Jack was out of the White House. Jack's body, after all, was still lying in the East Room." This reluctance from the most sympathetic member of the late chief executive's family appears to have resolved the issue for Johnson. He did not mention the issue again that day. That left the timing of the address. Once again, Johnson cited pressures from the leadership of the government. For those who were accustomed to Kennedy's frontal approach, such obliqueness was perplexing. Kennedy had characteristically prefaced an order with the phrase, "in my judgment." If you disagreed, you debated with him. Johnson presented himself as an entrepreneur of other men's ideas. In the event that they proved to be bad ideas, the promoter wasn't at fault. He had merely offered them for consideration. His cautious introductions, Bundy says, Rusk says, or McNamara says, absolved him from responsibility. That is so interesting that Kennedy could put forward his ideas and say, in my judgment, X, Y, Z. And then it invited healthy debate. Push back on me. Let me know what you think. With Johnson, he's floating an idea saying, so-and-so says this, so-and-so said that. And that way, if somebody has a problem with it and it gets batted down, it was never his idea. He was not the one at fault. I have to tell you, I have very strong hunches. I have not read books about him, but the articles that I have read and the information that I have push me strongly towards the perception that he is, at the very least, a raging narcissist and possibly a sociopath. That he was a very, very contriving man. And so this is actually really interesting because it fits with that perception of a narcissist that you can't bear to be criticized. You can't bear to be the one who's deemed wrong. And so by presenting it this way, he is showing a vulnerability actually that he has that Jack Kennedy did not have. He could put forward his idea and let it stand and even see it torn down by another person in debate and not feel that he himself was at risk. Johnson could not. On this issue, he told Shriver, the voices were unanimous. All agreed that the president should go to the Hill, quote, as soon as possible. That, quote, it was important to show the Johnson administration was taking over. Shriver agreed, though his reasons were his own. Extrapolating from his Peace Corps travels, he had realized that Asia, Africa, and South America would assume that whoever had killed President Kennedy would now be president. Maybe. We've read articles about that, haven't we? Dispelling that notion was important. The sooner the world was told that Johnson was not an employer of the Bravos, the better off the United States would be. And when both Johnson and Moyers said they preferred a Tuesday talk, Shriver replied, I'll speak to Bobby. Flack followed. Unknown to Shriver, Bundy had been assigned the same mission, and he had failed. Robert Kennedy had replied crisply, I don't like that. I think you should wait at least one day after the funeral. Bundy had told Kennedy that he was adjusting rapidly to the Johnsonian ambiguity, want it on Tuesday. So the aides are already adjusting to, instead of saying he wants it on Tuesday, they're saying they, like there's like so many people. There's a whole vast crowd of people that want this, not it's pinned on Johnson. The Attorney General snapped back. Well, the hell with it. Why do you ask me about it? Don't ask me what you want to get done. You'll tell me what's going to be anyway. Just go ahead and do it. If Johnson thought a Kennedy relative would make a more effective emissary, he was wrong. He was merely sending Shriver into a trap. Kennedy, exasperated by the new president's failure to communicate with him directly, listened to the proposal and then sharply said to Sarge, Why does he tell you to ask me? Now he's hacking at you. He knows I want him to wait until Wednesday. Shriver darted back, was ushered in by Moyers, and discreetly reported that Bob prefers you wait a day, unless there are overriding reasons for having the address earlier. Johnson immediately picked up his telephone and began pressing plastic buttons. To his listeners, he said tersely, It will be on Wednesday. Each of them needed no briefing. Every member of his staff was familiar with the background and was awaiting word from him. Shriver swiftly relayed the decision to his brother-in-law, and all that remained was a formal release from Pierre Salinger's office. Shortly before 6:30, the networks broadcast that President Johnson would speak to Congress at 12:30 p.m. on Wednesday, November 27th, the day before Thanksgiving. No commentator hinted that the president was being either hasty or a laggard, and only a handful knew of the dissension behind the announcement. It was understandable that Johnson would blame much of his frustration on Robert Kennedy. The Attorney General was symbolic of the past he had to overcome. It was also unfair. A study of Bob Kennedy's movements that day reveals that virtually all his time was preempted by funeral preparations. A satisfactory solution of the situation was clearly impossible. The need for the government to proceed was at odds with the Kennedys' grief. The president was being thwarted by something larger than any individual. He was attempting to start a new government, and everyone who could help him, including his own Texans and Washingtonians, who had been close to him for a third of a century, was floundering in the greatest surge of emotion all had ever known. Yeah, why wasn't he? There's another narcissistic trait. They don't seem to have empathy for others. They don't seem to have understanding of genuine emotion. And you see it here in LBJ, that he ought to be grappling with shock, grief, despair, and also getting on with it. He has to get on with it, and a man like him would need to get on with it and would have practice at getting on with it, even amidst crises. So I'm not saying that he couldn't get on with it, but his anger, resentment, everything being made personal when you're 36 hours out from assassination, it's indicative of something more. Just before departing for the Elms, Johnson talked to Ted Sorenson. It was a long session and representative. The invisible obstacles between them would have existed had Robert F. Kennedy never existed. Although determined to quit quietly, Sorenson took his responsibilities keenly, and he was anxious to be helpful. Before crossing the lot, he had prepared a list of exigent presidential business. With Moyers taking notes, they checked off each item carefully. Ted recalls his own manner as blunt and tough, yet it was not hostile. The president brushed off his resignation and listened impassively to his evaluation of the White House staff. Unknown to him, Johnson had been inquiring of others, "Is Sorenson an easy man to work with?" The answers had been mixed. Early in the session, the president asked, "What do you think of the possibility of a foreign government being involved in this?" Ted said instantly, "Do you have any evidence?" The answer was that there were no hard facts. Johnson showed him an FBI memo advising him that the rulers of an unfriendly power had been hoping for Kennedy's death. The report was too hazy for serious consideration. There were no names or facts, and the name of the FBI informant was in code. "Meaningless," said Sorenson, handing it back. The president said nothing. He asked whether Sorenson thought unusual safeguards would be necessary to protect him during the funeral. Ted shook his head. He didn't. Sooner or later, it was to be sooner, the relationship between the new president and the former president's special counsel was bound to deteriorate. As Sorenson had told a cabinet member shortly after 3 o'clock, he had invested over 10 years in John Kennedy's career. And now the investment was gone. Gone as surely as though he himself had been the victim in Dallas. Kennedy had chosen him because the fabric of their personalities had meshed perfectly. But Ted and Lyndon Johnson were entirely different men. Their styles were a world apart. Throughout that weekend, the president gave every sign of believing that he could preserve the Kennedy team intact. He couldn't. And when he had grown surer of himself, he realized he had to create his own team. Afterward, and especially after he himself had become an elected president in his own right, Johnson would seem to have forgotten that he had ever pleaded for the support of Kennedy's aides. The very mention of their names would annoy him. Within a year, he would even resent the Kennedy aura itself and become so sensitive to it that any Secret Service man or White House chauffeur who wore a PT-109 tie clip would run the risk of incurring the presidential wrath. Boy, that seems insightful, doesn't it? That within a year of a slain president, that he would be mad at even the sight of something that reminded anyone of John F. Kennedy. That seems absurd to me, to be honest. It seems absolutely ridiculous that anyone would behave that way. So we are going to leave our reading there. We do have one remaining session. So this is 9 of 10 of our William Manchester, The Death of a President. I would love to know in the comments what you noticed and observed. I think the biggest thing for me this time is just all the various pieces of evidence of Lyndon B. Johnson's narcissism. Some people might even say sociopathy. If you believe that he had any sort of foreknowledge about Kennedy, then it's even further beyond what we read here. But what we read here gives me serious thought about his character, lack thereof, his lack of empathy, his lack of insight into human behavior at all, and also the fact that he had no one around him who was thinking in that way for him. Because here's the thing, if you were someone who maybe lacked some empathy, maybe you are a hard-nosed person, then one option for you, if you have self-knowledge, if you understand that about yourself, then one option you have is to make sure there is someone on your staff who can tell you, hey, Chief, we got to hunker way back here. This is one of those moments. Remember how you've asked me to tell you? This is one of those moments when you're just not getting something. And it's this. The whole country is grieving. The whole country is in absolute shock. In fact, let me bring in a psychiatrist to explain to you what people are going through right now. Somebody who could do that for him if you have a degree of self-knowledge that, hey, I'm a rare personality where I kind of just don't understand emotions. Maybe, I didn't connect in that way. Maybe I have whatever. He did not have self-awareness. And everyone around him, even people who might be inclined to be on his side, are still like, that meeting was a disaster. What was he thinking? That was mechanical. What's going on? Why is he pushing to have all this stuff happen so fast? There's just a complete lack of awareness of what his countrymen were going through, much less his fellow men there in the cabinet. Well, let me know what you think. Those are my thoughts, and I am looking forward to, we have basically 2 more chapters here, and also a letter from Jacqueline Kennedy about this. So that's what we're looking forward to in our final episode. I hope you're enjoying it. I hope you'll come back for that final episode, and I will look forward to seeing your comments. Have a great day. Bye.